All right, right now in the five series, five jazz albums for people who may not really be into jazz. We're going to run through it, and each album is based on a different instrument. All right, so we're going to kick it off with McCoy Tyner, the great pianist. This album is called "Fly with the Wind." It's a cinematic album. It's a sonically ambitious album, and it's an album that takes you on a journey. It's called "Fly with the Wind," and it's literally no pun. You feel like McCoy Tyner is taking you by the hand and taking you on a journey through the clouds. It's a sonic escapade of of an album that anyone that's into music will appreciate just for the audio dynamics of it. Brilliant album. Next up, the great trumpeter Miles Davis. A friend of mine once downloaded like 200 MP3s to my iPod, mainly rock and roll stuff. But for some reason, this album was amongst those MP3s. This is years ago. It's like 16, 17 years ago during the iPad era, the iPod era. And I wasn't really deeply into jazz yet, but I was drawn to this album. It was on there, and I'd listen to it constantly because it was a voyeuristic peep into this genre that I wanted to get into, and it felt like what I would eventually like about jazz, if that makes sense, right? And it's the Great Quintet. It's the famous Miles Davis Quintet. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. Highly celebrated, legendary recording. You cannot go. You cannot like that record. Brilliant. Rick Laird. This is a off the beaten path one. I don't know much about Rick Laird. I know he was in the Mahavnishu Orchestra. I can never pronounce that right. That rock fusion jazz rock group. And he made this album called Soft Focus. And I think this is on Timeless Muse. Yeah, on Timeless Muse, which is a great label. He is a bassist. And this is just a record that's just like, it's just sweet and it's like cocktail jazz and not even cocktail jazz that lessens it. It's just a driving, biting jazz record, but it's understandable. You can relate to it. It's not out there, it's not avant-garde, it's not free, and all the musicians are on point. I mean, especially I love the piano on this. Tom Grant on piano, the great Joe Henderson on tenor saxophone, enough said, and Ron Steen on drums. This album is a steaming jazz record. If you're not into jazz, you'll like this album. I'm telling you, I'm not steering you wrong. Hank Mobley, no room for squares on the legendary Blue Note label. A celebrated album, and rightfully so. Why you would get into this? This album's like when I was a kid, I used to watch 60s films, right? And I never grew up with like jazz. I'm first generation Jamaican, grew up with reggae and like R&B. But I'd watch these films, and I'd hear that cool kind of slick kind of 60s jazz playing, and the guy that's in the skinny suit that's chasing the guy down the alleyway. It would be that this kind of a vibe to it. This album encompasses it. I'm simplifying this album because it's way more complex than that. It is a hard bop legendary album. Lee Morgan, Donald Byrd, Andrew Hill, Herbie Hancock, John Orr, Butch Warren, and Philly Joe Jones. This lineup is just absolutely bananas. But that's how you might process it if you're not into jazz. It's like a jazz that you recognize. Oh, he plays. Hank Mobley is on the saxophone. Thank you very much. Legendary saxophone player, Blue Note alumni. And this, we're getting into the drums now. Max Roach, legend of the legends. This is percussion bittersweet. This album is an album you listen to and you feel like you've been somewhere. Someone's handed you something that was very important to them. It dives into blues. It dives into R&B. It's got the percussive drum, clickety clackety, cymbally, snap, crackle, and pop sound that Max Roach brings, and it's just hard bop jazz. It's got so many elements in there, and it's just one big stew that makes sense. But you're listening to somebody that has drive, that has ambition, and is not content with being a side man or a side drummer. And this is a really great album if you're not really into jazz because you understand that something special is cooking, something brilliant is brewing, and we're Hi-Fi Recluse, and our record label is Good Find Records. And look, these are 5 albums, 5 jazz albums for people who aren't really into jazz.